mid-90s. Last year I was a young college student somewhere in the Midwest. It was my first year and I fell in love with the idea of the entire university life. I grabbed every stereotype I could think of. I tried to date a lot of people, went to as many parties as possible, and always said yes to drugs and alcohol. I was looking for that classic college experience. I did not attend a university, but was part of a medium-sized university community with a large student body. I lived a few villages away in a smaller, more rural community, and due to the distance, I wasn't interested in a daily commute. This led me to the logical conclusion of paying for a dorm room in my first semester like many freshmen, and really settling into my university days, so to speak. Moving into the dorm was the first time I moved anywhere, so it was like I was on my own or had my own place or something. It was exciting and new for me, and as I explained, I was very engrossed in my university life. That said, I was a closeted homebody. I didn't have many friends. My high school experiences hadn't really prepared me for the kind of encounters I wanted to have in college. There was nothing that could change it, no quick fix to make me popular or anything like that. And so I was someone who always said yes and tried to attend as many parties and events as possible. The university was great, and so was the dorm. It was a 70s-style brick building, very square with 3 floors and long, narrow corridors. I don't remember how many rooms or students the building could hold, but I estimate there were about 60 residents. We lived in Whitney Commons. That was the name of the dormitory. I think Whitney was the last name of a former professor or maybe even one of the investors, some big shot in the university's history. To me at the time, Whitney Commons sounded like the name of a luxurious apartment or an elegant complex. Most of these rooms were identically designed to accommodate 2 students with space to study and relax. I would say the rooms were about 3 by 5 meters, maybe a little larger, large enough for 2 single beds that were raised to accommodate a desk. There was a closet underneath, a chest for storage, a sink in the corner, and a small room divider for changing clothes. Some of the other rooms were slightly larger and designed for 3 students. Each floor had a shared bathroom with showers and all the trimmings. I got a room in the corner on the far side of the ground floor, which was perfect for me, easy to find, no stairs for moving, and I had a panoramic view of the campus because it was one of the few rooms that actually had 2 windows had. It wasn't nearly as great as it might sound, but it was my first experience away from home and I loved it. The guy I shared the room with seemed cool. He also lived in a rural community and decided that living on campus would save him a lot of time. I only spoke to him 2 or 3 times before he withdrew from all classes and moved back home. I don't think he even finished the first week of the semester. For some reason he went home, and no one else who had enrolled chose to stay on campus for the rest of the semester. Somehow I got lucky and became the only guy who didn't have to share a room. This made me somewhat popular with the others in the building, because my room was considered a potential party room. However, it never really happened. School progressed slowly, and like everyone else, I was overwhelmed by the workload of the courses. What little time I had left at the end of the day was spent relaxing or strolling around campus or exploring other buildings. I found that when living on campus, the buildings were sometimes unlocked. Somehow we had 24/7 access to most of the university's facilities. One day I heard something that would hold my interest for months. I was sitting in my room studying when I heard a woman's voice, shrill and playful. Since I didn't have a roommate, I usually left the door open so anyone passing by could talk to me. It was like an open invitation to bother me, even though not many did. The Whitney building was all male, like most dorms. The women's dorms were newer buildings, clustered on the other side of campus, closer to the academic buildings. Whitney was somewhat remote, literally on the edge of campus, so isolated by 3 huge parking lots that the closest building to it was the gym, which was isolated by a large parking lot and really wasn't used much except for weightlifting classes. Because we were a medium-sized university community, we weren't really known for our sports teams. What I mean by that is that our dorm didn't get many visitors. We were used to seeing the same people, the same cars in our parking lot. When the caretaker visited us, we all knew it immediately by the heavier footsteps of the other voice. We were all getting used to our neighbors and what to expect, so when I heard that female voice that afternoon, I really didn't know what to think. You probably don't have to guess what I did next. I listened. Leaning against my desk with my homework scattered in front of me, I dropped everything and gave in to this new distraction. Whoever it was spending the time with one of the guys in the room right next to mine. I didn't know any of the guys who lived there. I had only seen them with a textbook and had only encountered them at certain times in certain areas of campus. From this, I concluded that he was in a vocational program like welding or something similar, whatever the case was. The welder had brought a girl home. It was the first semester, so it was the first interaction of this kind to take place in our dorm, at least as far as I knew. I couldn't help it. I closed my door and moved my desk chair to the opposite wall to hear better. At first, they just talked, and they talked for a long time. They went back and forth for hours talking, sharing jokes, laughing, whispering. I know this all sounds scary, but this is an anonymous story, which makes it almost a confession, so I will say it was exciting to listen in secret. It became my new favorite hobby for the rest of the school year, and I was not alone. The boys who lived on the other side of the dorm in question were equally intrigued. In fact, we became friends because we all enjoyed listening. We bumped into each other in the hallway. The shoulders talked after class, compared notes about the different things we heard and what the girl looked like. The guy in the room quickly became a minor celebrity on campus, at least in the Whitney building. He took requests from people in the building, like what sounds we wanted to hear, words spoken, and the like. It was almost like we made our own interactive porn. The guy in the room, we'll call him Hank, absolutely loved the attention. As the school year progressed, Valentine's Day approached, and Mark, Pedro and I were very excited about what could happen on this special day. We joked about it. Getting popcorn, drilling a peephole, all these strange and scary things. I'm sure you can imagine our disappointment when we realized that for some reason we had a long weekend this weekend. Between the bad weather and the additional days off school, most of the student body and faculty had left campus. That meant most people went home. The Whitney building was a ghost town, especially for those who were left behind. Only Pedro and I were left in the entire Whitney building. Pedro and I holed up in my room, playing cards, listening to music, watching movies. It was a very young, sociable life. We only ate out fast food. Bags were loud and didn't shower. This continued until we heard someone open the front door of the building. Only someone with a key could open Whitney's door, meaning it was either a student or a member of staff. No outside visitors unless we let them in. Pedro and I looked at each other in silence, waiting to hear who it was. We were a little scared, almost as if we had been caught doing something illicit. So we stayed completely silent. The reality was that we didn't have any drugs or anything on us, so we were safe. We just listened as the footsteps came down the hallway without going up the stairs, meaning it was someone who lived in our wing, or someone coming to check on things. Maybe a janitor turning on the lights through the blinds in my window and wanted to turn it off. Our eyebrows rose and our breath hitched as the footsteps came to a stop outside the room next to ours and the local heroes. And as we listened, we could hear the clatter of 2 pairs of shoes. It was the boy and his girlfriend who had come back early to have a quick chat before classes started again. We were excited, but even then we could immediately sense that something was different. There were no excited whispers in the hallway, no frantic energy to undress as soon as the door was closed. The entire atmosphere seemed heavily irritated. We continued to listen and just looked at each other without saying a word, waiting to find out what the hell was going on. Then they started arguing. Apparently something had gone wrong on their first Valentine's Day together, probably during their visit to someone's house, and now they were mad at each other. At least that was the mood I perceived. It didn't take long for the argument to escalate. They started criticizing each other. It was such a drastic change from our usual behavior. Then they started screaming and throwing things. Finally, they started really fighting, and Pedro and I didn't know what to do. Clearly, the guy had no idea we were there. None of us were particularly good friends with him. But something had to happen at that point. The argument escalated from screaming to physical violence until there was a loud slap and then a choking sound. Pedro and I jumped up, ran down the hallway, and burst into the boys' room. Luckily, the door wasn't locked because when we got in, he was choking his girlfriend against the wall. The very wall I shared with him and through which I had listened for 4 months. I yelled at him to stop and that we were going to call the police. But Pedro went crazy. He jumped at the guy with a missile tackle and slammed him into the desk. At this point, the girl fell to the ground and tried to drag herself to me. I picked her up and took her to my room. Then I went back to join the fight again, just in time. The guy had broken free from under Pedro and was starting to gain the upper hand. I jumped on his back and grabbed his arms, pulling him to the ground, and by then Pedro was on top of him again. We didn't beat him up, we just held him so well. We were able to hold on until the police came. They took him away and we never saw him again. We saw the girl later on campus, but I don't think she really remembered us. Both were nearly drunk that night, which contributed to the violence. The girl finished the semester and then changed schools. The boy spent at least one night in jail, and I believe he ended up getting parole. I, on the other hand, stopped secretly eavesdropping and developed much healthier hobbies. Still, if Pedro and I hadn't been the weirdos we were this semester, we might not have been there to save that poor girl. I think I speak for all of us when I say that this wasn't the Valentine's Day we thought it would be. I'm 40 and a few years old and live alone in a very rural area on an island in the middle of Puget Sound. It's about 30 minutes by car to the nearest supermarket and an hour to the nearest larger city. The island consists of tall evergreen trees and is surrounded by water. It's a remote but beautiful place. My house sits on a high cliff overlooking a small bay. It's just a short walk through the forest to a sandy beach where I store my kayaks in a shed. All I have to do is get her out of the shed and lift her over the seawall. And now I'm on the water. There was a time when I was newly separated. My last long-term relationship collapsed when I discovered he had several other romantic interests. Apparently his business trips weren't entirely business-related. He moved out and I tried to move on. Some friends encouraged me to go to the market again. Have a few affairs. You'll feel better. It was well-intentioned advice. I knew what they meant. If I started dating again, I would stop feeling like that broken and lonely woman who was about to turn 20. Anniversary of her 25th. To celebrate birthday. If I started going out again, I would feel attractive and desirable. But how exactly do you start dating again when you live in the middle of nowhere? A colleague pointed out that almost no one meets someone organically these days. Everything is online. Tinder plenty, of Fish, Bumble, OkCupid. So I started creating online profiles, and it wasn't long before I was overwhelmed with messages. The affairs came. On the one hand, the energy of a new relationship was a good distraction, but on the other hand, I found myself comparing these new men to my ex. The comparisons were often positive. This guy always asked me how my day was. My ex rarely did that. Sometimes I missed things. He doesn't hold the door for me like my ex did, or his hand doesn't fit mine as well as my ex's did. This made me realize that I had gotten back into the dating life too soon. All of these mental comparisons were a sign that I still missed the past relationship. I wasn't ready for anything new, so I decided to focus on myself, which is what I should have done from the start. I hiked all over the island, went kayaking, trained my brilliant minions to use those talking buttons. I threw myself into my career. I rescued a kitten that was thrown out the window of a moving SUV right in front of me. To this day, my boyfriend loves his cat brother. They are still best friends. I bought a bright pink suitcase and traveled everywhere. I learned to shoot with a recurved bow. I did all the things I always wanted to do but had been putting off for some reason. Almost 2 years had passed. I rarely thought about my ex anymore, and when I did, it was without much emotion. I knew then that I was ready to let someone new into my life. So I logged back into my dating apps. It wasn't long before I received a message from a seemingly good-looking and intelligent lawyer. He lived in a larger city about 90 minutes away from me. We sent each other messages on the app for a few weeks and got to know each other better. Until then, he hadn't raised any red flags. I was confident. Finally, he asked to come to my house. No, red flag number 1. I wasn't ready to meet up with an almost stranger in the middle of nowhere, and I was sure he wasn't suggesting he come over just to hold hands. I told him that I didn't know him well enough to invite him to my house. He said he understood, and then invited me to dinner. He offered me to choose the restaurant. I was undecided. I was still debating. Because of red flag number 1, I really wanted to spend the entire evening with this guy after he indicated he was looking for more than just dinner. Then again, maybe he really was just looking for hand-holding. Or he hadn't directly said he wanted to go to bed, and he had quickly shown understanding when I said no to inviting him over. But dinner? What if he gave me bad vibes after a few minutes? I suggested we first meet for a drink at the bar of one of my favorite Japanese restaurants. It was about the same distance for both of us, I said that if things went well, I would stay for dinner too. He said it sounded great, and we planned a day and time to meet. We continued messaging each other throughout the week, and I grew to like this guy more and more. It seemed like we had a lot in common and similar interests. The previous red flag was almost forgotten. Finally, the day of our planned date arrived. I thought about what I should wear. Finally, I decided on a black blouse with ruffles on the front, skinny blue jeans, and black boots. I curled my hair, applied some makeup, and nervously made the hour-long drive to the restaurant. I deliberately arrived early, ordered a drink, and sat so that I could see the front door of the restaurant. I was the only one in the bar. I have to explain here that I'm actually not a big drinker. I drink socially occasionally, but not often. So I sipped my drink slowly, not in a hurry to finish it. I also had an hour-long drive home, so I didn't want to get drunk. He arrived on time, and surprisingly looked exactly like his profile pictures. He was the embodiment of the tall, dark, handsome guy, and I was already sold. I watched as he approached the hostess and explained that he was meeting someone at the bar. She pointed at me and I smiled and waved slightly. He walked confidently towards me and took the chair across from me. He smiled and said, "Wow, you are even more beautiful than in your profile pictures." Then he looked at the amaretto sour in front of me and frowned slightly. "Have you already ordered a drink?" "Yes, I started without you, so you should hurry up to catch up." He smiled again. "This is a challenge," he asked, and waved to the waiter. As we sat there, our conversation flowed smoothly. He was smart and charming. I realized I had misinterpreted the first red flag and wanted to spend more time with him to get to know him better. When we had finished our drinks, he suggested that the hostess sit us down for dinner, and I agreed to describe the scene. It was a teppanyaki grill restaurant. If you've never been to one, imagine a large rectangular stainless steel grill surrounded by seating on 3 sides. There are 3 seats on each of the 2 short sides. There are 6 seats on the long side directly in front of the grill. It's considered communal S-style, which means you're sitting next to complete strangers. When the hostess seated us, there were only 2 seats left at this grill, one at the end of a short side that was directly adjacent to the last seat on the long side. Instead of sitting shoulder to shoulder, we sat in the corner of the rectangle so that my left knee was almost touching his right knee. It was ideal, as we didn't have to turn to talk to each other. However, I was sitting next to a stranger on my right, and he had a stranger on his left. If you're an extrovert, eating together can be a really fun experience where you meet new people and take part in interesting conversations. If you're an introvert, you can just ignore everyone around you and pretend to eat alone. I'm not an extrovert, but I don't mind communal dining experiences, especially when there's good food. Our waiter came to take our drink orders, and the lawyer very boldly tried to order another alcoholic drink for me. "Oh, no thanks," said. I looked between him and the waiter and explained, "I only drink water. I still have to go home." The same frown as before appeared on his face again, and he said very harshly, "We're going to stay here for a while. You can have another drink." He looked at the waiter. "She will take another one." I was shocked, and so was everyone around us. That was also red flag number 2, and for me it was big. For the first time that evening, he turned his phone over and looked at it. Then he wrote something. I assumed he was just replying to a message or writing one. He placed it back on the table, screen down. He smiled again and then asked me what I wanted for dinner. It was almost as if he had just pressed play again, because everyone around us breathed a sigh of relief and continued doing what they were doing before. I, on the other hand, stayed on pause. It took me a moment to answer his question because a big part of me wanted to say nothing, put down my menu and get up to leave. But I didn't. The hungry part of me wanted to stay for the food, so I finally answered. I think I'll order this. Teppanyaki steak." Like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, he returned to his charming self. He was attentive, loving, and continually pointed out the artwork on the walls. I turned to look at her, but didn't find her as interesting as he did. I was still hanging on to that red flag. Number 2, solid soda that our conversation didn't go as smoothly as before. There were a lot of breaks, which gave him the opportunity to keep checking his phone. He kept it tilted away from me as he spent more and more time with it. This was the red flag. Number 3. In a moment, The man sitting across from him looked at his phone screen, and I will never forget the look on his face. It was a mixture of surprise and disgust. He quickly turned to the woman who was with him and whispered something in her ear. She also looked shocked. Even though I was watching all this, my date was completely oblivious and busy sending another message. I asked him all okay. Totally, just work, a case I'm working on. Boring things. You don't drink your drink, but I do, I said, taking another small sip. Red flag, number 4. Why was he so desperate for me to drink that drink? We alternated between forced small talk and his new obsession with his phone, until our chef arrived to prepare and serve our food. He had never been to a teppanyaki restaurant before, so he was excited about the whole process. The chef twirled his spatula, tossed an egg in the air and caught it in his hat, creating an onion volcano on the griddle and cooking our meal to perfection. My date actually left his phone face down on the table the whole time. However, as we started eating, he looked at his phone again and again. The man sitting across from him looked at the screen again and whispered something to his partner again. She looked at me. It was clear that she wanted to tell me something but couldn't. I assumed he was probably messaging someone on the dating app again, and that seemed scandalous to her. After all, they didn't know that we weren't married and he was just another cheater. But that didn't matter. I was still fixated on red flag number 2. I knew this would be our last date. I didn't want to see him again after that evening. When everyone at the table was at some stage of eating, he placed his napkin on his plate and pushed back his chair. I'm going to the bathroom, and when I come back, I'll make sure you finish this drink. Before I could even protest, I saw the couple next to him staring at me with wide eyes. They turned their attention to him. As he walked away, once they were sure he was out of earshot, the woman nervously turned to her partner and stuttered, "If you don't tell her, I will." He nodded with a deep sigh and, turning to me, said in a serious voice, "1, we think he put something in your drink as you kept turning to look at the art. It looked like he had tampered with it, so don't drink it. 2, he writes with someone, another man, I think." "Another man?" I asked, confused as he continued talking. "I think he's trying to drug you so he and this other guy he's texting can do horrible things to you. He says things like we can tie you up and take turns, and the other guy says we'll use you until we're done. I don't know, but I think you should leave before he comes back." The woman stammered anxiously, "It's too late. Here he comes." I turned in my seat just in time to see him quickly return and take his place between us again. Now about the drink. I had trouble looking at him. I shared a look with the couple. Then I forced myself to look him in the eyes as I stood up and grabbed my purse. I know. I have to finish it, and I promise I will. But now it's my turn to use the toilet. So I'll be back in a few minutes, and then you can watch me finish the drink. I'm pretty sure my voice was shaking, but even if he was, he didn't seem to notice. I turned around and headed towards the restrooms before he could even respond. Luckily, the toilets in this restaurant were right next to the front door, which was also the exit. I turned into a hallway and silently thanked my lucky streak that he couldn't actually see me exit. I walked right past the restrooms and out the restaurant doors into the cold night air. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door of my car and got in, locking the door immediately behind me. Somehow I expected him to run after me to chase me in the parking lot, but that didn't happen. I started the car and almost hyperventilated as I drove out of the parking lot. I took a deep breath, held it in my racing chest, and then exhaled slowly. I frantically checked my rearview mirror. No one. No charming and handsome psychopath, just me in traffic. About 20 minutes into my ride, I received the first message. "Are you okay? I'm worried about you." A few minutes later, "You fell down. Seriously, tell me if I can help you in any way." Then a few minutes after that, "I just asked the hostess to check on you. She said you weren't there anymore. You just left. Damn, what the hell." With each subsequent message, I mentally cursed myself for not blocking him before I left. I debated whether I should pull over just to do that, but I just wanted to put more distance between me and this potential rapist when I got home. I was still shaking so badly, even though the heated seats and heater in my car were on high. As I reached the driveway of my house, I pressed the remote button for the gate and saw it open. My thoughts then turned to my ex, who I hadn't thought about in ages. I silently thanked him for the paranoid feeling that had led me to install a private gate in the middle of nowhere. I had never given this guy any specific information about where I lived. But still, living on a fenced property gave me a little more security. I parked in my driveway and practically ran from the car into the house. I locked the door and locked it. She looked out the window into the dark woods that filled me with a feeling of terror. So I just went up the stairs. Then I looked at my phone. 17 more messages, all full of hate and malice. I quickly took screenshots of all our conversations and his hateful messages and blocked him, but it wasn't enough for me. I also deleted my account on the app and then all other dating apps because I didn't want him to find me on another platform. I thought about calling the police, but I had no evidence. I was sure the restaurant had long since thrown out my drink. I didn't have the information of the other people who had helped me. I hadn't seen the news myself, but then I thought, what if my story sounds familiar? What if he's done this before? Who should I call? The local police station, or maybe the police in the town where we ate? And what if he didn't actually live in the town he claimed? Finally, I decided to report it to the police non-emergency number in the city where we met. Honestly, I didn't think my report would have much impact, but at least I had done my part. For a long time, I didn't feel safe, especially at night. The blue herons returned this spring and built their nests in the tall pines on the bluff. They call to each other with deep calls that sound as if they could come straight from prehistoric times. These screams had once fascinated me, but now they filled me with fear. I didn't leave my house often. The rational part of my brain reminded me that I had been cautious, that I hadn't given it enough information to know exactly where I lived. He doesn't know. You're safe, I kept telling myself, but my panicked, anxious brain was full of what? What if he found out? What if he started looking for me? You have an internet presence. What if he finds it? What if the herons scream because he's lurking in the dark woods and they try to warn you? About 6 months later, while I was in town after work one day, I was volunteering in the garden at the local elementary school. A handsome man wearing a button-up shirt, jeans, and glasses walked nervously towards me. He stammered a few awkward questions about the garden and explained that he was a civil engineer and was working with the team that was building a ladder up the road. It was obvious he was nervous. He hesitated, trying to think of something to say, then apparently changed his mind, said goodbye and walked towards the team working on the salmon ladder. Then he paused, turned around and looked at me. Listen, you are really pretty, actually stunning. I don't know what I'm doing here, but could I maybe have your number? I smiled and gave him my number. It turns out that you can meet people organically after all. Fast forward another 6 months without any apps. The civil engineer and I were watching the evening news when the profile photo of this lawyer, who was constantly glued to his phone, appeared on the screen. A photo of another man appeared next to his picture. Both had been arrested and charged with multiple rape and drug offenses, in addition to 2 murder charges. I was later interviewed by a prosecutor's investigator, and our conversation was recorded as my official statement. The investigator gave me some more information. The duo was caught when the lawyer invited himself to his last victim's house. His accomplice had followed him and waited until she was drugged. This time they hadn't been so careful. A curious neighbor had noted the license plate number because he found it strange that someone would sit in a car for hours staring at the poor woman's house. Oh. And it turned out that the lawyer wasn't actually a lawyer. Although the investigator explained to me that I might have to testify in court. In the end, that wasn't necessary. The lawyer and his friend pleaded guilty, so I didn't have to face him in the courtroom. This spring, when the blue herons called again with their deep cries, I was finally able to enjoy them again, knowing that they were both behind bars and I didn't have to be afraid anymore. Everything had happened around Valentine's Day, which I somehow felt was poetic justice. Those bastards had gotten what they deserved and I was with someone I cared about. I had survived and they had to suffer. I was able to think about this when I went on my first Valentine's Day date in years. I'm sure there's more than one life lesson in all of this, but if you should take anything away from my story, it's this. Don't ignore red flags, don't make excuses for them. Don't downplay them. If something on a date triggers your warning system, pay attention, because it could mean the difference between life and death. My story is a bit strange to tell because it happened in high school and everyone involved was underage. Still, this was a very scary experience on Valentine's Day that destroyed the idea of romance for me for many, many years. In my senior year of high school, I started dating a 10th grade girl. Class to go out. The reality was that I was young for my grade, having just turned 17, and she was older for her grade, almost 16. We were in different grades, but there was actually less than a year between us. We call my friend Alicia. Alicia and I really shouldn't have dated. She was a good girl, came from a good family, but we just bonded and enjoyed spending time together. Her parents thought I was a bad influence and were really upset that I was a senior. Nobody explained to them the actual age difference of only 11 months. She just didn't care. To them, I was bad news from start to finish. That part didn't really bother me. It probably just made Alicia want it more, to spend time with me. Our routine was as follows. I picked her up at the bus stop around 7:3. We hung out until class started, saw each other between classes at lunch, anywhere we could on campus. We spent about 45 minutes or an hour together after school, usually near one of the baseball fields. Then we split up and everyone went home or did whatever was planned. I was busy doing the typical things of a small-town high school boy, driving around in my Blazer fishing. Play football. Alicia was at an after-school art day that happened a few times a week, which sometimes gave her an excuse to come home later. The other time we met was at midnight, sometimes at 1 in the morning. As a teenager, I lived what is now known as the lead key lifestyle, meaning my parents were hardly around, and when they were, they didn't really care what I did. Alicia, on the other hand, lived under what I would call a lock and key. Her parents kept a pretty close eye on her. This was before cell phones, so we were somewhat limited in what we had to do to be inconspicuous. I sneaked out of my house, took the residential side streets, and then turned off the engine about a block from her house. I rolled down the hill and stopped right in front of her house. Alicia was usually already waiting for me. She got in the car and I rolled the truck the rest of the way down the hill. Only after we had gone about 400 meters further did I start the engine again and we drove out into the night. There was a place outside of town that was like a big parking lot in the middle of nowhere. It was that one. Lucky Key place. Many people used it to unload their quads and snowmobiles depending on the season. From this place you could follow the gravel paths and end up in a fairly remote location. There was never anyone there in the middle of the night, except Alicia and me in my faded red Chevy. We hung out there until 3 or 4 in the morning. Sometimes we would just sleep, and then I would take her home just before sunrise. We did this almost every night for almost a year. It was tiring, but as young people deeply in love, it was really easy to endure. Honestly, it was all we wanted to do. We dreamed of moving in together, to have children. All these ideas about the future. It was cheesy, but I bet you once had a similar relationship. It was Valentine's Day. I think it was a Friday if I remember correctly. Alicia and I couldn't wait to celebrate this day too. I picked her up as usual, the same routine, only this time I had a bouquet of flowers, a box, chocolates, a handwritten card, and even a teddy bear with a balloon. I had never bought anything like this for a girl before, so I really tried hard. Of course, we drove to our place and exchanged gifts. We hadn't done that in school because she couldn't afford it. To take flowers or something home with you. These things stayed in the front of the car and we snuck into the back seat where things got hot and intense. The back seat of my Blazer was always folded down so we had as much space as possible. An hour of kissing, intense caressing, and things got more serious. Clothes began to fly away. Blah, blah, blah. Things progressed. Alicia ended up sitting on top of me. She took off her top, then looked up straight through the windshield. And when she did, she froze. "I think there's someone there," she said. Alicia and I spent a lot of time together, so we often joked around with each other. I quickly assumed that she was doing this to scare me and said, "Oh yes, he likes what he sees." Alicia covered herself and panicked, and that's when I knew she wasn't joking. I pushed her aside, told her to get dressed, and then put on my jeans. All the while I was watching far away through the windshield. On the other side of the parking lot, it looked like someone was standing there. I could vaguely see a silhouette in the moonlight, but it wasn't enough to be sure. I didn't have a gun or anything. We were just teenagers, but I had a crowbar in the back of the car, and of course an 8-inch flashlight. I got dressed and was about to grab the door handle when we heard screaming outside. I immediately froze. To be honest, I wasn't feeling particularly brave to begin with, and now that the guy was screaming, I had no interest in getting out of the car. Instead, I locked the door. We snuggled up under the big blanket I had with me and waited. The guy yelled a few more times. His echo echoed across the parking lot, and he began pacing back and forth. I knew he was really there. Part of me was hoping it was just some weird shadow cast by the moon, but no such luck. This guy seemed upset and sounded even crazier. Alicia reminded me that we had the key and could leave quickly, and I realized that was the best option. Apparently, this guy was trying to scare us, maybe even do something worse. So I made the decision that it was time to go. I slowly slid into the front seat, exposing myself to the moonlight and thus making myself visible. Something happened. I saw the guy stop pacing and then start running towards the edge of the forest. That was worrying because the city, it was about 6 or 8 km away. But honestly, it was more of a relief than anything else. I whispered to Alicia that the guy was gone, but she didn't believe it at first. We had spent countless nights in that parking lot and never saw anyone. A grown man lurking around there was beyond strange. I did my best to calm her down, and after a while everything seemed back to normal. We didn't hear any more screams, and the guy was no longer in sight. We told ourselves the story that it was just a drunk local staggering back into town. We started kissing again, had sex, and then fell asleep in the back seat. It was only 2:30 in the morning, so we still had some time before I had to take her home. I hadn't slept for more than 15 minutes when I heard a noise I couldn't identify. It was so strange that I opened my eyes. My first thought was that the screaming guy had come back and was stalking around my Blazer. I looked out the windows, and then I saw the shadow of something passing the back of the truck. It glided past and then came back the other way. It was definitely a car. I felt relief because the lights were off and the driver was quiet, so I assumed it was someone like me. I looked at the clock and watched the car slowly drive by. Then I tried to get some sleep again. Just as I was about to close my eyes, someone hit the back window of my Blazer so hard I thought it was going to break. My eyes widened, my heart stopped, and I waited motionless to figure out what the hell was happening. My thoughts immediately went back to the crazy guy from before. I remembered the car driving by, and for a brief moment I was hopeful that maybe some teenagers were just playing a prank and trying to annoy us. Maybe it was all just fun, but it wasn't. Alicia asked me what was going on. She also woke up from the noise before I could answer. A deep voice called from outside, "Get out of the car immediately." It was Alessa's father, and we both recognized him immediately. In that moment, every hope and confidence we had vanished, like air from a balloon. We sat huddled together, terrified of what awaited us outside. I imagined that maybe he had a gun, or a baseball bat, or maybe a piece of rope to tie me to the back bumper of his car and drag me all the way back to town. Alexa frantically asked me what we should do, but all I heard was the fear in her voice. I put on the rest of my clothes, took a deep breath, and told her to do the same. I decided to buy time by going out and talking to him. As I opened the car door, I was blinded by his bright headlights. He had purposely waited until I opened the door to turn on the light. I heard his car door slam and his footsteps quickly approached. I didn't prepare to defend myself. If he wanted to hit me, I would take it. I had probably given him the fright of his life by sneaking his daughter out of the house in the middle of the night. He came up to me and put me against the car. Then he started insulting me angrily. "Who the hell do you think you are? I'm lucky the sheriff isn't here and isn't pressing charges against you." He hurled everything you could imagine at me, from insults to threats. However, he didn't even touch me. I apologized and agreed with everything he said until finally Alicia got out of the other side of the car. Her father looked us both up and down and then asked if we wanted to say our last words. I told him I loved her. And she said the same thing before getting into her father's car. He looked at me again, but this time with a slightly different attitude. He said I would never see his daughter again, and then drove back into town. I stayed there alone for another 45 minutes or so, trying to calm myself down about what a crazy night it was. From this weird serial killer guy to Alicia's dad banging on my window. I literally couldn't believe everything that had happened. The route back into town led away from the parking lot I was in. So she saw the taillights of her car disappearing further and further into the distance. I considered myself lucky to be alive after these two incidents. I never saw that creepy guy again, but I saw Alessia again many times. A few years after high school, I proposed to her. Her father and I became good friends. We spent many weekends together on fishing trips. It was truly a full circle after I caused him so much grief, to become part of the family. A few years ago, I even attended his funeral and gave the farewell speech. Alicia and I turned 40 this year. Valentine's Day together. Celebrate. It always seems to me that gender-based violence is one of those realities where, unless you experience it firsthand or affect someone you love, it's easy to believe that it's happening far away, that it's happening to others. In other houses, in other lives. It's a comfortable, comforting thought that makes you believe that your world is safe, that you or the people you love are safe, immune to this dark web. But the reality is different, and what I will tell is the story of how I learned this hard lesson in the worst possible way. My name is Nelia, and I would like to share an experience that has shaped my life forever. Something that no matter how hard I try to forget it, always present, latent like a wound that never heals. Today, after many years, I can talk about it because I know that many women have gone through similar things. Just go, or could experience it. And if my story can help prevent that, then it was worth reliving these dark moments. It all started in such a banal, so ordinary way that if someone had told me how it would end, I would never have believed it. At that time, I was 26 years old and lived in a city called Madrid, which had always given me a feeling of security and anonymity. My life was calmly structured. I had my job, a small circle of friends, and even though I hadn't achieved everything I wanted, I considered myself happy, or at least content. But sometimes the nights felt lonely, and like many people my age, I spent time surfing the internet to distract myself and kill time. It was on one of those evenings when boredom and loneliness were more prevalent than usual when I met him. His name was Javier. We met in a music forum, a place where users shared their preferences, discussed their favorite bands, and recommended concerts. It wasn't the first time I spoke to someone online, but with Javi the conversation flowed differently with a lightness, which surprised me. At first everything was superficial, conversations about bands, exchange of opinions about songs and albums, but soon our conversations became more personal, more intimate. We began to confide in each other, to talk about our lives, our fears, and our dreams. It was almost as if we had always known each other, and this connection captivated me. Javier was 30 years old and lived in a small village in the province of Guadal, La Jara, just a few kilometers from Madrid. It was a place he described lovingly, full of peace and surrounded by nature. It took a few months of virtual conversations before we decided to meet in person. I still remember the day we saw each other for the first time. We arranged to meet in a cafe in the center of Madrid, a small one, but cozy place with a warm atmosphere. I was nervous but also excited and felt butterflies in my stomach that I hadn't felt in a long time. When I first saw him, it was as if the world stopped for a moment. Javier was exactly how I imagined him to be. Tall, strong with dark hair and a deep gaze that seemed to penetrate everything. His smile was warm, and when he greeted me, I immediately felt at ease, as if we had spent time together many times. We talked for hours, laughing and sharing anecdotes, and when it came time to say goodbye, I knew I wanted to see him again. Our relationship developed quickly after that first meeting. Javi was everything I wanted in a partner, attentive, lovingly, always worried about me. He made me feel special, unique, like the world revolved around me when we were together. We started going out regularly, and every time we were together, I felt like I had found the person I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. But there were small details, signs that I can clearly see now, but that I ignored back then. Sarcastic comments about my clothes, disapproving looks when I spoke to a friend, little outbursts of jealousy that I justified as signs of his love. They were things that from the outside looking in, I would have recognized as clear warning signs, but I was in love. And when you're in love, you tend to justify the unforgivable, to only see what you want to see. After a year of relationship, Javi suggested that I move in together. He said he couldn't bear the thought of being far away from me. He wanted to share our lives completely and protect me. and take care of me. The idea made me happy. I thought it was the natural next step in our relationship, the logical progression of what we had built together. So excited for a new phase of my life, I agreed. Within a few weeks, I gave up my small apartment in Madrid and moved into his house in the country. At first, everything seemed perfect. Living together was pleasant, and I enjoyed the peace and quiet of the village, the contrast to the hustle and bustle of the city. Javi's house was cozy with a garden that he tended lovingly, and although I didn't know many people in the village, that didn't bother me. I was happy to be with him, to have our own home, our little bubble of happiness. Javi continued to be the charming man I had met, or at least I thought so. But soon, very soon, things started to change. I remember it was a summer night when the first serious argument happened. The heat was oppressive, and we were both exhausted after a long day. I can't even remember how it started, probably because of the little thing of a misunderstood comment, a word said in the wrong tone. But what I do know is how it ended. Javier, who until then had always been loving, suddenly turned into someone I didn't recognize. He yelled at me with an anger I had never seen from him before. He called me stupid, told me that I was of no use, that I was worthless. His words made me freeze, as if a bucket of cold water had been poured over my head. I didn't know what I had done to deserve this, but instead of confronting him or asking for an explanation, I stayed silent and apologized. I thought it was something unique, that he was just having a bad day, but it wasn't. Over time, arguments became more frequent and almost a constant part of our everyday lives. Javier found Immer, something he could complain about, something I did wrong, something he didn't like. His criticism became a constant companion, a poison that slowly destroyed my self-esteem. He told me that I was fat, that I looked ridiculous, that I was worthless. And instead of defending myself or questioning his words, I believed him. I thought maybe he was right. Maybe it was me who failed. I tried to change, to become better, to do everything to please him. But nothing I did was enough for him. What were initially just hurtful words soon turned into something more. Javier began to control every aspect of my life. I couldn't leave the house without him allowing me to. Couldn't talk to my friends or family without him knowing. Whenever I dared to contradict him, the consequence was always the same. Screams, insults, and sometimes a shove or a slap in the face. Every time I tried to stand up, every time I tried to think about running away, he found a way to make me small, to show me that I had no one, that he was the best thing that had ever happened to me, and that without him I was nothing. Still, I was unable to leave him. I was trapped in a toxic and abusive relationship, and the worst part was that I had become so isolated that I had no one to turn to. My parents lived far away in Andalusia, and although I spoke to them from time to time, I never told them what really happened. I didn't want to worry them, didn't want them to know that their daughter, who had always been so strong and independent, was now a shadow of her former self. I also felt shame, a deep and crippling shame. How could I admit that I had let my life get this far? How could I admit that I had become the woman I had always sworn I would never be? It was my younger brother, Carlos, who finally discovered what was going on. Carlos and I had always been very close. Despite the age difference, he was always my best friend, my confidant. Although we didn't see each other often because of the distance, we spoke on the phone at least once a week. During one of our conversations, I couldn't help but burst into tears. I didn't give him any details, just told him that things weren't going well, that I felt lost. Carlos, who had always been protective of me, insisted on coming to see me, and although I initially refused, I was eventually persuaded. When Carlos came to the village, I tried to keep up the facade, to show that everything was okay. I did everything I could to hide the truth, to maintain the image I had worked so hard to build. But Carlos wasn't fooled. He looked into my eyes, those eyes that knew every corner of my soul, and saw what I was trying so desperately to hide. Fear. Despair, sadness. He stayed with me for a few days, and during that time Javier behaved as usual. But Carlos was perceptive, and soon he began to notice the little details that I had long since learned to ignore. The looks that Javier gave me, the way how he controlled every word I said, every move I made. The situation escalated one evening when Javier came home earlier than expected and found us both in the living room. He didn't like what he saw at all. He approached me with such anger in his eyes that a chill ran down my spine. Without saying a word, he pushed me against the wall. Carlos, the person who saw this, immediately jumped up, stood between us, and tried to protect me. Yes, Javi. Infuriated, Carlos began to insult and threaten him. He shouted that Carlos had no business being here, that he should leave, that he shouldn't interfere in his affairs. I tried to calm him down, told him everything was fine, that we were just talking. But he didn't listen to me. His eyes were full of anger, and in that moment I knew he was capable of anything. What happened next happened so quickly that I could hardly react. Javier, in a fit of anger, turned to me, raised his hand, and prepared to hit me. At that moment, driven by a mixture of panic and anger, Carlos pulled out a knife from his pocket, a knife that he always carried with him for safety, and stabbed Javier in the thigh. Javier's scream filled the entire house with animalistic, loud pain and anger. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to understand what had just happened. What followed was pure chaos. Carlos and I tried desperately to stop the bleeding while Javi, pale with pain and anger, continued to scream. His face was contorted with anger, and for a moment I thought he was going to attack us both. Such was his frenzy. Somehow we managed to call an ambulance. When the paramedics arrived, Javi was shaking. His body was covered in cold sweat, but he was still conscious. His eyes were focused on me, and the look in them, a mixture of hatred and despair, is something I will never forget. They took him to the hospital, and we were arrested by the police. A long and painful process followed. During the interrogation, I told everything from beginning to end. The police took both my and Carlos' witness statements, as well as evidence of the abuse I had suffered. I had bruises on my arms and wrists, traces of his control and violence. They also found messages on my phone that Javi had sent me. Fortunately, full of threats and hatred, the police realized that Carlos had acted in self-defense, and he was not arrested. But the trauma of what had happened left us both deeply scarred. Javier never came near me again. After he was released from the hospital, he moved to another province, and we no longer had contact. Through a mutual friend, I learned that he was building a new life in a new place, trying to put what had happened behind him. But for me, his shadow remained like a ghost that followed me even from a distance. It was hard to recover from everything that had happened. It took a long time for me to accept what I had been through and start rebuilding my life. The first few weeks after the incident were the worst. I couldn't sleep or eat, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his look full of hatred. I blamed myself for what had happened and kept wondering how I had let it get to this point. I felt a mixture of fear, shame, and sadness, which consumed me and blocked my way out. But little by little, with the support of my family and close friends, I began to heal. I realized that it wasn't my fault, that I hadn't done anything to deserve what I had experienced. I understood that gender-based violence is an insidious trap that traps its victims in a cycle of control and abuse from which it is difficult to escape. And although the wound will never completely disappear, I have learned. Living with it, wearing it as a scar that reminds me that I am stronger than I thought. What I learned from this experience is that we must never ignore the warning signs in a relationship. Gender-based violence can start subtly, with small verbal or psychological aggressions, but if not stopped, it can escalate into something much worse. No one deserves to live in fear, and no one should feel like their life is in the hands of another person. If anyone reading this is in a similar situation, I beg you, don't wait until it's too late. Seek help, talk to someone you trust, and remember that you are not alone. Since their emergence, social networks have changed our lives in unimaginable ways. They have allowed us to connect with people around the world, share our ideas, and create global communities. But like any powerful tool, social media has a dark side, a side we rarely notice until it's too late. Behind every profile, every perfectly staged photo, and every seductive message, there can be something or someone hidden that is completely different than it seems. This is the story of how I learned in the worst possible way that nothing is what it seems on the internet. It all started a few years ago when I moved to Japan for work reasons. I've always been an introvert, someone who likes to spend time alone. And although life in Tokyo was exciting, it was also lonely at times. The nights were particularly difficult to endure. The language barrier, the culture, and the lack of close friends made me feel isolated. So I handle it. Like many others in my situation, I turned to social media and dating apps to meet someone and fill the lesson I felt in my new life. I started using one of those apps popular in Japan, where people create profiles with carefully selected photos and leave descriptions that often seem like something out of a romantic movie. At first, everything was quite superficial, light conversations about hobbies, music, eat. But after a few weeks, I found myself talking to a woman who seemed very interesting at first glance. Her name was Aiko. In her profile photo, she smiled warmly with bright eyes and a delicate beauty that seemed almost unreal. The conversation with Aiko was different from the start. It wasn't limited to trivial topics like the weather or food. Our conversations delved deeply into personal and intimate topics. She told me about her life in Tokyo, her work in an art gallery, her dreams of traveling the world. There was something about her expression that captivated me. She was smart, funny, and seemed to understand me in a way that few did. Over time, I began to feel a real connection, something that went beyond the boundaries of the phone screen. After several weeks of daily conversations, we decided it was time to meet in person. Aiko suggested that we meet in a small cafe in Shibuya, a place she described as cozy and discreet, perfect for a first date. Although I was nervous, I was also excited. I had spent so much time imagining what it would be like to meet her in person that the idea of it finally happening filled me with a mix of anticipation and fear. On the day of the date, I prepared myself carefully. I picked out a shirt I thought she would like, made sure my hair was in order, and left my apartment with my heart beating faster. The cafe was within walking distance, and when I arrived, I was surprised at how small and cozy it was, exactly as Aiko had described. The walls were decorated with modern art and soft jazz played in the background, making the atmosphere warm and relaxing. Aiko came a few minutes after me. She was even more beautiful in person, her slim figure, her long dark hair, and the same bright eyes that had captivated me in the photo. When I saw her, I felt a knot in my stomach, but also a relief. Everything seemed perfect. We greeted each other with a smile and a slight nod of the head, as is common in Japanese culture. We sat down at a table by the window and soon started talking. The conversation flowed just as naturally as it did online. We talked about everything, our childhoods, our jobs, our expectations of life in Japan. Everything seemed to be going great. After a few hours, Aiko suggested they go to her apartment. She said she wanted to show me some art she had collected, pieces she had acquired on her travels at that moment. I had no doubts whatsoever. I felt comfortable with her, and the idea of continuing the date in a more private setting seemed exciting to me. Her apartment was in one of those modern high-rise buildings that are numerous in Tokyo, with an impressive view of the city. The building was elegant, with an immaculate reception and an elevator that quickly took us to their floor. When we got to her door, Aiko opened it with a smile and invited me to come in. The interior of her apartment was just as elegant as the rest of the building. Everything was perfectly organized with minimalist furniture and decoration that reflected her good taste. There were several paintings and prints on the walls and a collection of small sculptures, all from different parts of the world, on a coffee table. We sat down on the sofa and they started telling me about the artworks and explaining the story behind each one. As she spoke, I realized how much I enjoyed being there with her at this moment. But there was something in her tone, a kind of nervousness that I hadn't noticed before, but that I chose to ignore in that moment. Maybe it was just the excitement of the moment, or maybe she was just as nervous as I was. After a while, Aiko got up and said she had to go to the bathroom. She wouldn't be long. I stayed alone in the living room and looked at the paintings and sculptures she had shown me. A few minutes passed and I began to feel a slight discomfort. The silence in the apartment became heavy, and I suddenly realized how little I really knew about her. At that moment, a slight feeling of unrest began to grow within me. A few more minutes passed and I started to worry. I got up from the sofa, trying to hear any sounds that might indicate that Aiko was okay. I approached the bathroom door and gently knocked on Aiko. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound calm. There was no answer. My heart began to beat faster and all sorts of irrational thoughts suddenly appeared in my head. I decided to wait some more, telling myself that she probably just needed time, that there was nothing to worry about. Just as I was about to go back to the sofa, I heard a noise. It wasn't the sound I expected. It was the sound of something moving around the room, but it wasn't coming from the bathroom. It came from the hallway, from the place Aiko had come from. Before I could react, the bathroom door opened. But it wasn't Aiko who came out. Instead, a man appeared, a man who couldn't have been more different than Aiko. He was short, stocky, with thinning hair and an unkempt beard. His clothes were disheveled, as if he had dressed in a hurry, in his eyes. His gaze was full of something that made me instinctively back away. "What are you doing here?" I asked. My voice shook as I tried to understand what was happening. The man didn't answer. He just stared at me, a wry smile appearing on his lips as he took a step towards me. The unease I had felt before now turned into an instinctive fear. Something was very wrong, and my body knew it before my mind understood it. I tried to stay calm and slowly backed away towards the apartment door, but he moved quickly, shortening the distance between us. I felt my back hit the wall and my heart began to beat even faster. "Where is Aiko?" I asked again, my voice almost breaking. The man laughed, a harsh, empty laugh that echoed through the room. He came closer, and I could smell his sweat, and something else I couldn't identify filled the space between us. "Aiko won't come," he said finally, his voice deep and menacing. At that moment, reality hit me like a train. Aiko didn't exist, or at least not as I had believed. Everything had been a trap, a twisted game to get me to this place at this moment. The woman I had been talking to for weeks, the one I thought understood me and cared about me, was actually this man or someone who worked with him. A wave of nausea washed over me, and the fear that had been growing within me turned into pure terror. I had to get out of here, but he was too close. His presence was oppressive, almost paralyzing. I tried to stay rational, tried to stay calm, tried to convince myself that if I played smart enough I could get out of this situation. But every word that came out of my mouth was met with more laughter, with looks that made it clear to me that he was in control, that I was just a puppet caught in his game. "What do you want?" I finally managed to say, even though I knew I wouldn't like the answer. The man tilted his head, his smile widening. "I want to have fun," he replied. His eyes roamed over my body in a way that made me feel even more vulnerable, even more exposed. My mind was blank, the panic fog clouding my thoughts. At that moment, I only had one goal: escape. It didn't matter how, but I had to get out. My opportunity came when the man, convinced of his superiority, distracted himself for a moment. Maybe it was fate, or maybe just luck, but I saw how his attention faltered for a split second. I took advantage of this moment and pushed him back with all the strength I could muster. He didn't expect it. He stumbled and fell back, crashed into a table, knocking several of the sculptures to the floor. I didn't wait to see if he recovered. I rushed to the apartment door. My hands shook as I tried to turn the doorknob. When I finally managed to open the door, I ran down the hallway. My heart raced as I heard the man's footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around. I knew that if I did, the fear would overwhelm and paralyze me. I just kept running down the emergency stairs. As quickly as I could, the building seemed to be a labyrinth. Every hallway and door blurred in my vision as I tried to find the exit. Finally, I reached the front door, threw it open, and stepped out onto the street. The cold Tokyo air hit me full force, but I didn't stop. I kept running as far away as I could from this place, from this man, from the trap I had fallen into. I don't know how long I ran or how long I was outside before I finally allowed myself to stop. My legs were shaking and my breathing was ragged, but I had managed to escape. I looked around, tried to orient myself. The city lights seemed brighter than usual, almost blinding. People walked past me, unaware of what had just happened to me. For her, it was just a normal day in Tokyo, while for me it had been a nightmare. Finally, I found a bench in a small park and collapsed onto it. My body shook as I tried to process what had happened. Thoughts flooded into my head, but none managed to fully form. I had narrowly escaped a terrible situation. I had been deceived, manipulated, and put in a situation that could easily have ended tragically. And the worst thing was that there was no sign, no indication that could have warned me. Everything had been so normal, so perfect. Days passed before I got up the courage to tell anyone what had happened. I felt a mix of shame and fear. as if admitting it would make everything even more real, even more tangible. But I knew I had to talk about it. If there was one thing I had learned from this experience, it was that I shouldn't let fear control me was allowed, that I had to be strong. So I finally told her. I told a close friend, someone I could trust. He listened in silence, and when I finished, he looked at me with a mixture of concern and relief. He was grateful that I had escaped with my life, that I had been lucky enough to escape. I never found out who this man really was, or how he managed to deceive me so perfectly. I tried to report the incident to the police, but with so little information there wasn't much they could do. However, it turned out that it wasn't the first time someone had fallen into such a trap. After this experience, I rented social networks and dating apps for a while. The fear and distrust stayed with me for months, and even affected my daily interactions. I became more cautious, more reserved, and every time I met someone new, I couldn't help but think about that night. Of this fear. Now, when I look back, I still get shivers down my spine when I think about what could have happened. But I also know that this experience taught me a valuable lesson. The internet can be a dark and dangerous place where things are often different than they seem, and where the truth is hidden behind carefully constructed masks. It doesn't matter how authentic someone appears online. There is always risk, and it is important to be vigilant, to protect yourself, and not to lull yourself into a false sense of security. If I could give one piece of advice to those listening to this story, it would be to never let down your guard. Be aware of the dangers that lurk in the digital shadows, and above all, always listen to your own intuition. Because sometimes that inner voice is the only thing that keeps you from falling into a trap.